down in Alabama. Fall guaranteed you a few things. One was that it was still going to be humid. You never knew when a thunderstorm would strike. Two, it meant that once you made the rounds at what few houses were handing out candy at night, there was little else to do but get into trouble. That's what the story's about. When letting my true feelings take the driver's seat and running out of consecutive constructive things to do collide. It did not help that I was of the less popular variety at the school, which wearing a mask was a relief from my regular torment. Those preteen hormones in small town life were a ticking time bomb if you ever know one. What is that saying? Idle hands are the devil's plaything. The saxophone president was busy yapping on the television, and my mother was buttering up to my father in an attempt to get to see Titanic when it came into theaters. I was busy working on my Halloween costume at the kitchen table and trying to tune the two of them out. When you grow up in a single wide trailer in Podunk, Alabama, you tend to not have the funds for the fancier things. But I was tired of going as a bedsheet ghost and hobo clown. I wanted to be scary. I wanted to be a real monster. I wanted to make Jeffrey Scott in front of his dim-witted football jock friends. I wanted to be anything but the poor, miserable fat kid for the night. I just could not let my mom know I was using her makeup. A few brown stitches in an old drop cloth, some old pine straw, a pair of overalls, and my dad's flannel shirt did not look much by itself, but with the right amount of tweaking, it made for an interesting scarecrow. But it was still missing something, however. My pawpaw Mac had always been good for ideas, and he knew just the way to top off my get-up. Literally. It took a bit of digging through the tool shed. That place was a mess from the front to back. Granny said she had no idea how he kept track of anything out there, but he managed to find the straw hat he was looking for. It was quite it was missing quite a few strands, and you could tell that it had been a snack for a mouse or two, but it fit perfectly. His trusty old timer made a few jagged cuts and he said with a wash or two it would look proper rug. He told me if I got into trouble to just tell my parents it was his doing. They did not question him in anything. When the sun went down on that little town, I set out I set out down the drive with my homemade costume, hand-me-down hat, and a potato sack my granny had rustled up for gathering my tape for the night. The grin behind that ugly material would have been enough to scare anyone, if they could have seen it. I was so excited I couldn't barely contain it. I was bounding from door to door in no time. Some of the porch lights had not even clicked yet. I was eagerly for the late arrivals to retrieve their treats, belting out the command for candy, trick or treat. My sack was half full within the first hour, but there was no way I was turning in early. This was one of the best days of the year, second only to Christmas, and even that could be disappointing when your parents are broke. Free candy was free candy, and that was more than enough to help me forget the beads of sweat that coated my body under the thick material. My night was running out, much like my sack when I noticed Jeffrey and his goons making their rounds with the younger kids. They were not satisfied with gathering their candy. They had to have it all. I knew all too well what would happen if they knew who hid beneath the face I so carefully crafted. I had to make sure to get the first hand in. So I made a quick sprint for the trees that separated my neighborhood with the next. The cluttered clumps of trees made for good hiding when I worked up a plan. The potato sack did not want to fold up with how full it was, and I knew that there was that in the dirt ants would take my hard work. So I figured it would be the best to hide in a tree. Let me just say, not that it is hard for a big boy to climb a tree, but that candy was safe in the lowest branch just by how tired I was after getting that dang thing up there. Sweet sweat was burning my eyes and irritating the heck out of my thighs, but I was determined to get my revenge for every spoiled All Hallows Eve. It took a few throws, but eventually a pecan landed square across Jeffrey Scott's nose. The chase was on. It took all I could not. It took all I could do not to laugh as they followed me deeper into the woods. I weaved in and out of trees, but I knew that eventually they would catch up to me. Remember how these guys were football ogres? I'd have played smart and possibly set up a trap. I had passed a few rusted old fords and knew I could hide and squat behind that holy heap of Detroit muscle. I tried to catch my breath and waited for the horde to bound over that last hill that I crossed getting down here. It took longer than I thought for them to catch up. The, bu- the bubblicious I had shoved in my cheeks earlier that night had already lost its flavor by that time. I heard leaves rustle. It was so dark I could barely see them, but it was easy to tell their location by the flickering lights of our flashlights. The sounds of shuffling came to a stop a few yards away and were replaced by voices arguing back and forth over which way to go. They had passed me in their effort to close the gap, and now I sat behind them. It was a perfect opportunity to creep up on them and make them pay for every piece of candy taken and tear soaked cotton cloth spirit causing that ever existed. I had never been much to hunt, but I knew that if you wanted to be quiet enough to keep from scaring off a deer, you had to make sure your steps were heel to toe and deliberate. I felt like a real monster stalking its victim, and my heart pounded in my chest with excitement. When I was sure my next action would get the best result, I gave my best rendition of Rebel Yell. Three of them ran off without looking back, and Jeffrey spun on his heel, eyes wide, searching for the source of the scare. The look on his face was priceless. Mama always said to make sure to tie your shoes. She would go on and on about how one day I would trip up on those things and end up in the emergency room. Well, Jeffrey Scott's mama had obviously not driven home that lesson because just as he came around to see my ghoulish mask, his other foot landed firm in his untied shoelace and sent him tumbling back. I expected to see an explosion of brown and orange leaves, but instead, Jeffrey disappeared altogether. I crept closer as my feet came to rest just beyond where the bully once stood. I noticed the ground gave way a little bit and faded to nothing shortly after. 10 feet below me lay Jeffrey Scott. He had become the new hood ornament for the King John Deere. The boy in the tractor laid life. The scene was almost poetic, really. By the time my 11-year-old mind could properly process it, it was no longer after I found myself sobbing in my mother's arms. I removed my mask early that night, and had not thought to put on the happy sunshine ones that should have replaced it. I fought for a good 30 minutes trying to understand the hobbled up rambling of the story I tried to tell. I think I apologized more times that night than I had since, and she had almost pieced it all together when my father stumbled in with a Bud Light in his hand. She pulled him to the kitchen, and I listened to a hushed rendition of what I tried to tell him earlier. They both returned shortly after. My father seemed a bit sober suddenly from the news. He finished off his drink, crushed a can, and sat at my papa's. The two of them made another trip to the tool shed and emerged with a shovel each. I did not want I did not have to watch to see which direction they were headed. Meanwhile, my mother dried my tears and ran me. She told me that she would be back shortly to get me in bed. I heard her lift the receiver on the phone in the kitchen. She gave her a call. He was just Uncle Dave to me, but the rest of the town knew him as Sheriff McDougal. It took a long time for me to get to sleep that night, but the next morning my photo sack full of candy was waiting for me at the end of my bed. Mama did not make me go to school the next day. Dad offered to take me fishing. He never did that. I was not up for a trip though. I stayed in bed most of the day, chewing on the Tootsie Rolls and Smarties. When I did go back to school, I got a fair amount of looks, but no one said a word to me. Jeffrey's seat sat empty. Miss Reynolds was wiping a tear from her eye as she entered. She did not call the missing child's name during the roll call. Some of the kids were whispering about the flu going around and Jeffrey being at home sick. But that was but that bit of gossip only lasted a week. The missing child posters came next. Mr. and Mrs. Scott came by the house a few times. Mama offered them sweet tea, Dad handed Dale a beer. It was odd watching them act as nothing had happened at all. Mrs. Scott cried a bit. That tugged at me was somewhere deep in my stomach, but I dared not say anything. I mean that look he always had after a few too many cans of Budweiser. I still cannot make sense of why the two of them did what they had. What everyone in town actually knew, or why no one ever asked me if I saw Jeffrey Scott that night. What I did learn that Halloween was two very important things. First, there is a deep gully in the woods behind my neighborhood, a place where Uncle Dave made sure no one searched his following Halloween. Secondly, you should never threaten a son their mama's baby boy.